Well, hi, everyone. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies here at the University of Denver. It's my pleasure to welcome you to another Faculty Friday. Today's topic, immigration. Few issues have been more fraught in recent years than immigration. Certainly, President Trump portrayed it as a national crisis, might have contributed to that himself, and certainly restricted significantly immigration. President Biden has struck a different tone, but now he faces significant challenges in dealing with immigration. As you know, in recent weeks, the U.S. has experienced a huge increase in migrants seeking to cross the border, including an enormous number of unaccompanied minors. Big issues facing the Biden administration about how to handle that. And of course, once immigrants are across the border, their troubles don't end there, particularly for undocumented workers. They face many challenges, including, as we'll talk today, often denial of wages and employee benefits that they're rightfully owed. Well, today, joining me to explore these topics is Korbel School Associate Professor Rebecca Galemba. Professor Galemba is an anthropologist who studies the intersections of globalization, illicit markets, migration, security, and labor in Mexico, Central America, and the United States. Her book, Contraband Corridor, Making a Living at the Mexico-Guatemala Border, examines how trade and border security policies constrain and criminalize local livelihoods, as well as how ordinary people navigate in the policy landscape. Professor Galemba also conducts research on the impacts of immigration enforcement, discrimination, and weak labor protections on immigrant labor rights here in the US. And a particular focus of hers is on the problem of wage theft from undocumented workers, which we'll talk about today, and is the subject of a recent TEDx talk. Rebecca is currently engaged in a project to examine how more stringent immigration enforcement is affecting the criminal justice system here in Colorado. So a perfect person to discuss today with us the issues facing around immigration. Welcome to Faculty Friday, Rebecca.
Thank you.
So many things to talk about, so little time. And for those of you in the audience, we'll talk for about 40 minutes and then open up for Q&A. So put your questions in the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we can. Let me start, Rebecca, with the issue that's making the headlines today, which is the huge number of migrants at our southern border and that challenge facing the Biden administration. In March, I think there were about 172,000 encounters, which was up 71%, I believe, from the month before, and 18,000 or nearly 19,000 unaccompanied minors, which was nearly double that of February. This is a heck of a challenge. First of all, just explain to us sort of what is happening at the border. What is happening to these people? I know some are being forced immediately back to Mexico, but the children are often unaccompanied minors are in the U.S. And so tell us what is happening there.
Great. Well, thanks. First, I just want to thank you for having me. I'm technically on sabbatical, so this talking into the void is a little bit new for me, but thank you for being here. Yeah, so I think there's been sort of, I think there's always a flurry of media attention to the border, especially particular moments, without necessarily looking at the border in a little bit of a longer and wider view. The border is often used as a political football, and we're seeing that right now of how that's being used to drive a wedge into Biden's other immigration plans. And this isn't new. I mean, this has been going on for decades, where the border is used, and actually, in fact, there's been a lot of bipartisan support for deterring migrants on both sides of the aisle. And so, this didn't start with Trump, although I think it came to new, obviously vitriolic heights with that. And so, what we are seeing in the recent few months is an increase in the number of unaccompanied minors. Many people, that's a little bit more recent, but the other trend is also now an uptick in young male adults, which was actually a trend that started last spring, but is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past couple of years, but is more consonant with traditional migration flows. But I think what's really important to understand is that you keep hearing these things in the headlines like crisis and surge. And I think that framing, one, it's not necessarily accurate, but in fact, it could be quite dangerous. And we've
Mhm.
heard this language of crisis for decades. In fact, many argue it's exactly what led first to the border buildup in the 1990s. This idea of an out of control border or a border in
Right.
crisis. And what that does is basically create this vicious cycle with more enforcement. It makes enforcement seem as the only answer. And so I think, can kind of create that vicious cycle when in fact it doesn't work. It creates, in many cases, a lot of problems. But I think it's also important to take the numbers in context. And so,
Mhm.
yes, we might have an increase from, a prior month, for example, but actually some of those spikes were bigger in 2019, which was the height of some of Trump's most draconian practices. And so saying this is a sign of Biden's weakness, as you
Yeah.
hear, isn't really necessarily accurate. Plus, the height of actually border apprehensions was in the year 2000. There were 400,000 in the same time period. There was a really great piece, actually. Some of you may have seen it, that came out in the Monkey Cage from the Washington Post just a couple of weeks ago from a group of scholars led by Tom Wong. And what he argues, I think, is really important is that we have to look at these not as month to month in a given year, but these months in comparison to years in the past.
Mhm.
And why that's really important is because migration is quite seasonal, and largely crossing the border is quite seasonal. And so you often do see these seasonal increases in the spring after the winter months, and then ratcheting down slightly in the summer when it gets brutally hot
Mhm.
in these regions of the border. And you see that every year looking at these seasonal issues. And what they point to, what's really interesting, and we've seen this over time, is that these draconian aggressive deterrence policies don't stop migrants, and Biden's language doesn't cause them to come, but
Mhm.
what this impacts is sometimes the routes that people take or are forced to take, and the timing of when they take those trips. And so
Right.
what they argued in that is, yes, we see some increase, and in fact they're pretty similar to 2019, and especially even more similar when we basically say, these are the 2019 numbers plus those who couldn't come in 2020 when the border was effectively shut down, as well as when COVID restrictions and lockdowns were more prevalent in parts of Central America. And so people actually couldn't leave. And so you're seeing some very similar trends to 2019. Plus some of the backlog from that. The other thing has changed, and why we're seeing so many unaccompanied minors is somewhat of a change in policy. And so Trump invoked Title 42 in March, which is incredibly controversial. It's an old public
Mhm.
health measure. It's never been applied to this extent in the border. And what that pretty much was doing was summarily expelling people who came to the border. The CDC at the time didn't even think it was necessary, and was pretty much steamrolled by the administration into passing it.
This is ostensibly a COVID protection measure.
Yeah, but it doesn't, I mean, it basically, there's weak legal backing for it. That it shouldn't override our other laws and legal obligations to the right to asylum, which effectively it does. It doesn't even screen people for credible fear interviews. It just basically expels them either to Mexico, Central America if they're from there, or sometimes planes if they are from further away. And in fact, since there's so much other travel and so many exemptions to other forms of travel, many argue that the public health rationale isn't there either. We don't invoke it at airports,
Doesn't
for
make
instance.
sense
It
at
doesn't
all.
apply to tourists. It doesn't apply to the immense of traffic that we have of people conducting business every day still across the border. And in fact, many people argues it actually exacerbates the COVID risk that Border Patrol has to deal with, because what you mentioned encounters, I think that's really important, is that after Title 42 was put into place, we started just categorizing encounters, which aren't apprehensions, they aren't arrests, they're different things. And so what many people argue is another reason we see higher numbers is these are merely the same people trying to cross
And
over
people,
and
that's right,
over
they get
again.
expelled
And
and
of
they try
course,
again.
right. And so if you put in the repeat rate, again, these numbers look similar because, again, they're not even put into any form of proceedings. They're just basically expelled. And so many people are more likely to try again. But what did change, and this wasn't actually a change originally under Biden, it was actually a federal district judge who ordered that you couldn't apply these restrictions to unaccompanied minors. And sorry, just to backtrack, the reason I think it can spur more COVID encounters is because if they're crossing again and more encounters with border enforcement, you could argue
Oh, I
that
see.
more
Yeah,
encounters
yeah,
is not a
that
good
makes
thing,
sense.
right?
Yeah.
With COVID. But why we're seeing again more unaccompanied minors is because of the legal order, although then that was actually, there was actually another court that overruled that, saying they could actually be expelled
Yeah.
under Title 42. Biden decided not to do that.
Yeah.
So he decided to stick with the original order that they weren't going to subject unaccompanied minors to being expelled under Title 42.
Yeah.
So what you're seeing now is, of course, some of those minors who couldn't get in before, some people who think that may be their best chance. 80% of those children and minors have family members in the United States. That's also really important to remember. So it's not just the pushes that are driving people here, it's also the pulls. And what happened is, you had a lot of centers that were closed, you have restrictions under COVID. And so the terrible conditions and, really the crisis we're seeing is the inability to have capacity for these children, who really shouldn't be held in border patrol cells from the law. They can't be held more than 3 days. And in fact, they are, and is leading to some of these conditions because there isn't the space. I believe Biden's opening up a new facility, but there is actually talk about processing them more quickly to family sponsors, which I think is something we'd want to see of why do they even need to be held for a month with Health and Human Services when they have family members
So
here.
let me, this is super helpful in putting those numbers in
Yeah.
perspective, give us a picture of what's happening. And so fair enough, the notion of crisis is maybe counterproductive, as you say. Nonetheless, there's a large number of people seeking to come to the U.S. and it is remarkable. Of course, many unaccompanied minors, as you point out, they may have family members in the U.S. Still, and as you point out, or as you say, this isn't because Biden is soft on immigration, because Biden is a kinder, gentler face of immigration. So then the question is, what is driving this, and what are the conditions, particularly in Central America, where many of the migrants are coming from? What explain to us sort of what are the drivers that are, because it's a big deal. I mean, it's not easy. It's painful. It's dangerous. It's people are taking huge risks to come to this country. Obviously, they're highly motivated. What can you tell us about what is happening in the countries where these migrants are coming from?
Yeah, and I mean, and again, a lot of these drivers are not new. There's a reason that Central Americans come to the United States is because of long ties to the United States, whether that be from our government's own intervention in their countries, which is something that I can talk about, or the fact that I believe the numbers are about 1 in 5 Salvadorans has a relative in the United States. There's strong family ties. But what we have been seeing, and this is really, I think, a trend that started around 2013, 2014, which really started changing the composition from the kind of traditional male economic migrant from Mexico of kind of working age to more families, to more unaccompanied minors, to more women with children coming increasingly from Central America, was these kind of aggravating conditions. And I think, again, there's a legacy of that. That's not new. And I think that many argue, well, violence, crime, poverty, but oftentimes it's taken out of context as if these were inherently violent countries, right, or violent people. And in fact, I think what is often left off the conversation, and there's actually a great interview today that was in Mother Jones with Cecilia Menjivar, who is a scholar of El Salvador, who talks about that we need to look at our own complicity of our own policies in Central America, how that not only fueled conflicts in the 1980s, but also our own deportation policies, which have helped spread gang violence in these countries, of our economic policies in these countries that have furthered, export-driven development, and violent governments that have dispossess people of their land. And you saw this really kind of intensify in the last couple of years. And I think, that's aggravated by things like climate stressors, by coffee rust, which is a huge driver now from Guatemala. And I think, all these issues compound one another, especially with the weak governance structures that are in place, recent natural disasters. And I think many people point to the fact we're seeing so many people now because Honduras and Guatemala were impacted by two Category 4 hurricanes in November, and you adding the devastating impacts of COVID, right, on weak infrastructures, economies, and healthcare systems. And, I think one thing that is often left out is, our plans often to kind of tackle these root conditions, right? You hear that all the time, are as if we often repeat with our own aid the problems that are causing the problems to begin with. And so, I think one thing that many bring to light is that, there was a coup in Honduras in 2009, which was largely authorized, legitimized, continues to be, the government that took place continues to be funded by our government. There's many calls to stop aid to Honduras that are just aggravating the conditions from which people are fleeing. And many of that, especially in a place like Honduras, have really upticked since 2013. 2014, you had both Guatemala and Honduras kick out their impunity commissions just in the last couple of years as well.
You point to the legacy of American policy, ongoing, I guess, American policy is at least partially complicit in the conditions that might be driving people to leave Central America. I guess that raises, and this is probably too big a question to tackle in some ways, but it raises the question of what should policy be if we're thinking long term. And I suppose the corollary there is the extent to which you see in the Biden administration changes in policy that might be, more hopeful, more productive, more progressive than the policies of the past.
Well, I mean, I think, and again, Biden was the architect of, the Alliance for Prosperity under Obama's administration. He has a new $4 billion proposal to tackle root conditions in Central America. And I think these are all really well-intentioned until you look at where the money goes and what the money does. Many of these policies going towards security assistance, which sounds great on the cover until you talk about the fact that the president of Honduras' brother is currently sitting in federal prison in the United States for drug trafficking, right? And he is under investigation as well. He embezzled funds from the healthcare administration to fund his campaign, right? And we are giving money to these governments. And I think, there, has to be a way of thinking about ways of assisting countries so that there's actually support for genuine democracy. But many cases of where the money has gone, whether that's security assistance, whether that's in the form of mega projects like hydroelectric dams, which are often, mining, sometimes even roads and electric, the ways that those have often been foisted on people in very violent ways and that don't trickle down, and many argue kind of merely repeat the kinds of kind of monocrop or extractive forms of development that the US has long supported in Central America and supported repressive governments when people tried to protest against that or reform elite strangleholds and concentration of land. And so I think, we have to look at what kinds of development programs are going to be implemented. Not ones that further drive people here or that instill more poverty wages. And in fact, many argue, after the coup in Honduras, there was a wide scale privatization wave there, which was really actually many people arguing kind of setting this poverty wage model, which doesn't help people stay in their countries by any stretch of the imagination.
You pointed out such a complex issue, obviously. You mentioned in the two hurricanes. I know some of your work, or at least is already and I think you're looking to the future to do more in the area of climate change and its impact on migration. I'm curious, as you look to the future and you think about another, more enlightened forms of development assistance, for example, how we ought to be thinking, how big an issue is this going to be? And to what extent should we really be thinking about improving the adaptive capacity of countries in Central America and elsewhere to mitigate or minimize the forced migration that climate might cause?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to continue to be a major issue, and something that I have been looking at is to what degree does it promote forms of adaptation or resilience versus to what degree does it compound all these other drivers that are already there to kind of this idea that life cannot be sustained any longer. That is, forcing people out of rural areas into urban areas where, as I mentioned, wages are low and crime has become prevalent, and then the next step is often when people are fleeing. And so I think we definitely need to address what communities and organizations are already trying to do on the ground to promote resilience and adaptation to climate change, provide ways that don't necessarily deter people when they can't survive those circumstances. And I think the problem with the way that climate change has been portrayed, at least in the kind of migration landscape, is that it's portrayed as another crisis, right? Or as another emergency. And of course, that may, pose crisis situations for people. But the way that's been interpreted kind of at the policy level by the government is saying, well, this is going to cause these huge waves of migration without really quite understanding that, but also it lends itself again to we must stop that, right? To this deterrence versus actually kind of trying to address ways that people can sustain life, complicity for that, for trade policies that make it even more difficult for people to survive on the little land and the devastation that it's suffering from climate change. And so I think there's a danger when it's kind of portrayed in that way, because in fact, it's led to more knee-jerk kind of enforcement solutions to deter people from moving in the first place. And so, that's something I think we need to look into, as well as the fact that it doesn't qualify for any form of protection. And I think there's been a lot of debate over, protecting people who are climate refugees, right, in the meantime. And so, of course, there's a lot to be said about fostering forms of resilience. But in the meantime, if the solution is just to brutally repress people in place, that's only going to aggravate these pressures that people are facing.
Let me, we could carry on in talking about this for quite a long time, but I do want to turn to your work here in the U.S. and because much of your work is really around the experience and the treatment of immigrants, particularly undocumented workers in the United States. And one of the main thrust of this is around wage theft. And frankly, I'd never known about wage theft until I got to know you and read some of your work. Okay, what's the problem here? What is wage theft? How widespread is this phenomenon? And what's causing it?
Yeah, and so I mean, I could talk about it in two senses. So wage theft obviously goes way beyond immigrant workers, but in fact, it's very related to the work that I've done in Mexico and Guatemala of what's driving people to migrate, right? And then what happens once they're here, right? And why they're so vulnerable to various forms of exploitation, of which wage theft is just one. But wage theft is actually much broader. In fact, many argue it's a national epidemic, and it just refers to the ways that we're not getting the wages and benefits that we're legally entitled to as workers. And this is a problem across the world. I mean, it's kind of, and it's really a problem in many cases of deregulated industries, of weakening organized labor, of employers' power over workers, and the ability to, not just underpay people or pay them less than when they're worth, but in fact to steal their wages. People who work in kind of the most sort of unregulated industries are ones that rely most heavily actually on women, people of color, and immigrants are the most vulnerable. But in fact, it's quite widespread and unchecked. Most people don't even know what's happening. And even when they do, despite the laws, they're so weakly enforced and difficult to access that the problem can be quite pervasive. And so there's many forms that can happen. And in fact, when I've had students in my classes, many of them realize that this has happened to them as well, as they start to learn about it. And you know what, immigrant workers, and especially the ones that I've worked with in Denver, who are day laborers, meaning they search for work on a daily basis for cash. For them, it often means, you know, they work for the day and their employer disappears. So they say, I'll pay you on Friday. They never show up and they don't get paid at all. But there's many more nuanced ways that it happens. You know, many people argue it's common at, you know, stores like Walmart and big box stores where, you know, people clock out and they say, well, just unload this truck. They're working off the clock. It's really common in the restaurant industry where people's tips are stolen or they're not paid the minimum wage. For people who are in qualified industries that don't get overtime. There's people, especially in construction, where this is particularly pervasive, is that employers will claim they're independent contractors, which basically means they aren't obligated to pay the minimum wage and overtime, as well as avoiding a host of other obligations to payroll taxes, to other forms of insurance. And by that way, they're also stealing workers' wages and benefits, as well as our tax dollars.
No, you point out this is not restricted by any means to undocumented workers, but it's also the case that they may be particularly vulnerable to that. Now, as I understand, even undocumented workers have certain rights and are covered by labor law. But explain, talk about why it is particularly difficult for undocumented workers to exercise those rights.
Yeah, and so, I mean, labor law is one of those interesting areas that actually does cover undocumented workers, not in everything. So, for example, there's been some court cases where, for example, if they're fired as a result of unfair labor practices, they can't seek their back wages. So there are definitely some restrictions, but if they are, working in the US in a covered industry and an employer, they still should be receiving minimum wage and or overtime if they're, depending on the industry. Just as US born workers. And people ask, why is this so? It's not that the US cares about undocumented workers. It was largely, it's designed originally to keep employers from accruing an unfair competitive advantage by underpaying or not paying unauthorized workers. That's basically the symbol of what IRCA employer sanctions are for as well. But what that does mean is that they do have recourse under US wage and hour laws. The problem is, undocumented workers are caught in a catch-22, right? They technically don't exist. And that was the reasoning for not being able to get back pay. The reasoning was, well, how do they have access to those wages when legally they didn't work at all, right? In fact, though they did, right? And so that's sort of the reasoning. So it's really sometimes hard, even when they're motivated to come forward and submit a claim, to show that they worked in the first place, that they exist in the first place, that they're not nervous to interact with the government bureaucracy, all the others of which are trying to surveil and support them, right? And I think this has gotten worse with what you see as an increasing criminalization of immigration and employers feeling very beholden to threaten workers who already, again, the way that our kind of labor rights system is largely organized is it's very individualized and it's very reactive. Meaning, we'll help you if you come to us. There's not as much top-down investigations, and that's largely, and there's a really interesting article that came out that talks about the funding of the Department of Labor on one hand, and ICE and immigration enforcement on the other. And it's a David and Goliath situation. The Department of Labor has been eviscerated over the past 30 years, has basically the same or fewer resources to monitor an escalating number of workers in workplaces. Meanwhile, you've seen ICE and immigration budgets balloon. And so if you think about the fact that retaliating against someone for lodging a labor complaint because you threaten their immigration status, that's illegal. But is anyone going to enforce that? If the employer says, well, you might not want to go to court because ICE might be waiting outside, does that do anything to stop ICE from actually doing that? And so, they're dealing with a stacked deck as well as a catch-22. And so even when these kind of forms of retaliation are illegal, because of those resources and the fear, employers are likely to get away with them. And in fact, many people don't come forward because of the fear, but also because of the time and opportunity costs. And so, we found a lot of workers that were cheated out of their wages, but the rational thing for them to do is not to spend months chasing their wages through the court system or trying to pay for an attorney who may not even end up being an attorney at all.
Right.
But was just like, let's just go out and find another job and hope that things work out better the next time.
You used the phrase criminalization of immigration, and you talked a little bit about it, but I wonder if you could expand a bit on that and the other ways. As you noted, wage theft is one of multiple issues of perhaps facing immigrants and maybe particularly undocumented workers. But and maybe you've already explained it with the budget, the David and Goliath metaphor. But what do you mean by criminalization of immigration? How extensive is it, and how does that, and what are the other ways in which that sort of plays out in the life of immigrants in this country?
Well, there's definitely, and I don't think it's new, but we definitely saw Trump make these explicit references that I will not repeat, but an association of unauthorized immigrants with criminals that then also becomes very much equated with Latino, undocumented, and sometimes with Latinos more broadly. This kind of racialized threat narrative that's historically applied to the US-Mexico border that has now and is increasingly migrated inwards to kind of paint Latinos and especially Latino immigrants with this kind of broad brush, right, of illegality, of criminality. And in fact, most people don't know this, but unauthorized presence in the US is not actually a crime. It's an administrative violation. But what my colleagues in the law school, and I don't know if they're on this call, but they're the experts, would call that we've had increasing what they call crimmigration, which is the meeting of our immigration system and our criminal justice system, not only how they kind of increasingly work together, and that's something I think that that the Biden administration needs to more substantially look at, which has largely been left untouched. The way that almost any encounter with law enforcement can sometimes lead to immigration consequences, whether someone has actually committed a crime or not, but also that more and more immigrant conduct is treated through the criminal justice system, and that immigrants are held to different standards than US citizens. For example, an aggravated felony can pose dire incarceration and deportation consequences for crimes that actually don't even need to be aggravated or felonies in the criminal context. And so they're held to a different standard. And this is broadly applied to especially Latinos who come from south of the border, because many of the kinds of immigrant conduct that we now increasingly treat through criminal penalties have to do with crossing the border. And so if you look at this, again, it reinforces this idea of the criminal immigrant, because we incarcerate and we detain and deport people, many of which are for immigration related crimes only. So again, we increasingly criminalize crossing and recrossing the border. This is not applied to people who overstay their visas, who actually are increasingly the portion most responsible for what has led to joining the undocumented population in the US every year. But people don't talk about that, right? They talk about crossing the border. And in fact, those kind of very policies on equal treatment are what led to things like Trump's family separation policy, right? And so I think we have to look at this idea that we associate. And so people often assume these kind of ideas of criminality, but in fact, researchers have shown that communities with large populations or significant populations of immigrants are actually experience less crime. And in fact, immigrants are less, what it does is make immigrants more likely to be victims of crimes because people assume they won't report them and to collaborate with law enforcement.
Yeah. So it's interesting. You referenced this sort of discourse around immigrants, the framing of immigrants as criminals, as a piece of this. I want to sort of stepping back even from the particulars of Latino immigrants. We have seen demonization of various immigrant groups, or from the anti-Muslim statements and the Muslim ban to obviously Trump statements about Mexican immigrants to more recently the spike in anti-Asian rhetoric around COVID. Obviously, this isn't new in the sense that we have a long history of demonization of various immigrant groups, but it does seem that it has become somewhat more acute. And so I'm curious, if so, stepping back, how important you feel it is, the tenor of that conversation, the ways in which we imagine immigrants, the images that we have available to us in the popular media and elsewhere. How important is that context to what we are seeing in the policies around immigration?
I mean, we've obviously historically seen immigrants as well as people of color, right, scapegoated for various kinds, of economic and social anxieties, and something that I'm increasingly talking about in my book is it's not just that we steal immigrants' wages by not paying them, right? That's a continuum of the form of theft that becomes erased and justified in our own kind of lifestyles or forming of this country, right? And so we think about, it's not just that we outright steal wages. Why are certain populations paid less to begin with, right? That because they're immigrants, we can pay them less, or the fact that we're sitting on stolen land, right? Or that we have, populations who, we've literally stolen their bodies, right, and their labor. And so I think that's a continuum of the racial formation of this country, and something that we need to contend with, and that we can't necessarily exceptionalize stolen, instances of stolen wages without understanding this larger history that we are dealing with. And so, again, I don't think this is new, but we've seen it come out, I think, in recent years, much more blatantly. But I do think that in many times there, when it's ignored, it's also quite harmful because it
Mm.
naturalizes privileges as a natural order of things rather than as a result of stealing, of conquest, right? So even thinking about the ways that the border itself was even formed, or why we naturalize this idea of our border and securing our border, right? I mean, most of that territory belonged to Mexico, right? Why did we have the Mexican American War, and thinking about how that fit into our own preoccupations with slavery at the time, and the native populations whose territories span that area. And so,
Right.
I think this is, something larger that we need to
Yeah.
situate ourselves in.
I often think certainly when you're talking about immigrants from Central America or from Mexico, ethnically, these are Native Americans in in a sense that probably have as much right to the land here as anyone else. Um, let me tell our audience that I'm going to ask one more question, then I want to open up for questions that you might have. So put your questions in the Q&A. Um, we could talk. I could talk with you forever about the substance of this. Let me ask you, Rebecca, just to say a few words about things that are happening here at the Korbel School and at DU. In addition to your work, I know maybe you could say a word about your teaching as well, but also you're part of the co-leader of what we call a knowledge bridge around migration, which involves quite a number of people on campus. So maybe you could say a word about that, because I think there's a lot of interesting work going on here at the University of Denver around the issues we're talking about.
Yeah, so we have some incubator funding from DU we started the DU Center for Immigration Policy and Research. So DU SIPR, and Lisa Martinez, I think I think I saw her in the participants, is the co-director of that initiative over in sociology. And we have colleagues from all over the university, the law school, geography, arts and sciences, media, film and journalism, mortgage, social work. And the goal is to really bring together a lot of the faculty as well as community work that's happening on immigration. We focus on 3 pillars, largely issues related to education and health, labor, as well as politics and law. And the goal is to bring together some of our research, but also our teaching and community engagement. And we will be having kind of a short highlight event of our center on April 29th from 12 to 1. And so I can send out that information when it gets a little bit closer. And so we are kind of just getting started and building that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to what you will do, and any of you in the audience are prospective students and have an interest in issues of immigration, migration. It's a good place to come. There's a lot of great work going on here. Let me, I do want to save some time for the audience and not monopolize you entirely to myself. So let me just ask some of these questions. So John Owens asks, how will President Biden's massive infrastructure plan, if approved, impact immigration into the United States? Interesting connection.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's hard to predict, but again, a lot of immigration, I think it depends on what's motivating them. And so, many of the people that we're seeing now from Central America, a lot of it has to do with the compounding threats to life, whether, that's compounded by climate change, by disasters, by poverty, by violence. But I think, we've seen historically that also economics drives migration, family ties, as well as demographics. And I think that's a huge thing to think about. And, most people don't know this, but, migration had actually been on decline largely because for most years until very recently we're seeing some different trends, but migration in this country is largely determined by migration from Mexico because it's the largest, and in fact that started to decline in the mid 2000s and actually turned negative in 2007, meaning more people were leaving than coming here from Mexico. And largely some of that had to do with the recession. So I think, anytime there's a recession or lack of jobs, people aren't going to come here. People don't want to leave their countries often if they do not have to. And I think that's something that people don't understand. It's not to say like, oh, we have this or we open this idea of the floodgates, like people are going to come. Most people don't want to actually leave their families and communities if they do not have to. And in fact, most migration was cyclical. And I think people don't understand the fact that for people who want to enforce the border and stop people from coming, I mean, one, it doesn't work. But two, it actually had the unintended effect. It actually is what led the unauthorized population of people who are then vulnerable for a whole, wide variety of reasons, including obviously wage theft, because they stayed rather than coming in and out as they needed to or wanted to, because it became prohibitively expensive and risky to cross the border. And so what did people do to make those costs worthwhile? They stayed longer. And so we had to think about that. The other thing is demographics, and we might be seeing a similar shift in Central America soon, is that frankly in Mexico, you tend to have traditional demographics that migrate more than others. The 16 to 32-year-old male, even though those flows have diversified. And in fact, Mexico's undergone a demographic transition and there are just fewer of them. Many argue that could happen in Central America. We could see similar things. And so, I don't know how much an infrastructure plan necessarily will drive migration. I think, again, depending how the economy is doing, if there's and I think it's also the other way around. And something I've looked at with my research is that it was specifically a lot of our restructured industries in the 90s that drove these waves of migration in the 1990s. We basically deregulated industries that did not go abroad. We were paying wages that were so low that many US born workers fled these industries. And so what did we do? We courted immigrants. And, Ruth Milkman argues that many of these companies even went to Mexico to recruit these workers deliberately. And so it's not that we're creating, this magnet, people are going to come. It's often deliberately driven by the same kind of corporate forces that are also displacing the American workforce at the same time. And so I think that we have to keep that in mind too.
It's very interesting. Melissa Garland asks a similar question. How much is the U.S. Farm Bill and its subsidies lowering prices and competition force South American farmers out of farming and into the cities? And then she said, versus climate change, I guess, other factors. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this is something I've written a lot about in my, not necessarily the Farm Bill, but especially for corn, in my prior work on the Mexico-Guatemala border, where, the impacts of, free trade agreements, especially NAFTA, which did actually allow Mexico to phase out their tariffs, but they didn't because their companies profited from it, basically. But the fact that we continue to subsidize our own corn, right, and basically led to this influx of cheap corn that made it impossible for many smallholders to make a living, and then they had very little else. And you add that kind of intensification, the increase in inputs that people had to even try to get anything out of the land, then you add climate change to that, that's been a huge problem. I think same thing with the coffee sector. Once you had the deregulation of international coffee markets, right? You saw this in the late 90s. That was when you first had this huge exodus of people leaving southern Mexico, as well as Guatemala. And then you add those kind of difficulties of competing now in the international coffee market with the impacts of climate change and coffee rust. And I think that is what's compounding a lot of people's just inability to make ends meet with, a few other means to sustain livelihoods. Many argued, with NAFTA, other jobs will come, right? Factories will come. And in some areas of Mexico, that was true. Not in rural areas. In fact, in many cases, they intensified agriculture because there was nothing else. Or they migrated to the more northern border to work in some of those factories where, wages were not enough to allow people to subsist. And if people tried to organize or complain or uplift those wages, those companies moved.
Yeah. That corn issue in the NAFTA was one I worked on a long time.
Oh yeah, sorry about that.
Oh no, it was a real mess because it also got tied up with the trade around high fructose corn syrup, which displaced sugar production in Mexico. Meanwhile, we continued to maintain very high, very narrow, small quotas on sugar imports. It really was destabilizing. Was a really unfortunate feature of the NAFTA. I wonder if you could say just a quick word about coffee rust, because I don't know how many people know of it, but this is a big deal, right, in the world of coffee production, and quite problematic.
Yeah, I mean, so, I'm not an expert, obviously, on the kind of aspects of that, but it's caused by, a fungus.
Right.
And that is, all aggravated by the change in climate.
And it's really spread quite wide. I mean, it's really threatening
Yeah.
Coffee production.
Yeah, and this is something I'm interested in looking at a little bit further. I haven't looked at it in depth. There's been a lot of media coverage of it. Some people that I've been collaborating with on this new project have been looking into this as well. But basically, the inability to sell those harvests. But in many cases, those prices also had been so low to begin with. But many argue, sometimes it's also driving for people who used to work on the coffee plantations, right, or work in agriculture, right? Those, plantations or even small farms aren't hiring people anymore because there isn't the work, because there isn't as much crop. So it kind of ripples down as well.
Yeah. Sid Brooks asks, given the new historic highs of newly arrived immigrants, it gives the numbers apprehended, and recognizing that children without parents crossing the border costs about, I guess he says 60 million per week is the current cost of keeping these folks safe and housed. Where is the tipping point for needing to deter or stem the rising tide of immigration across the southern border? Is there a limit at all?
Yeah, and so I mean, as I mentioned before, I think 180,000 sounds like a lot, but if you compare that to the U.S. population, actually, it's not a very big number. If you compare it to the number of apprehensions in 2000, which was 400,000 in the same time period, it's also a lot smaller. And I do think that we spend so much money. I think you're right. This is super expensive. We spend so much money on immigration detention and deportation that could be put to other means of actually just integrating people and providing them a legal pathway to either reunite with their families or the ability to safely migrate when they needed to. And I don't have the numbers offhand, but the amount that it costs us as taxpayers to actually detain immigrants is pretty obscene. And these private companies are largely profiting off of that. And while many show that, about 90% and sometimes more, especially if they have legal representation of people seeking asylum, show up for their hearings, there's no reason to detain them except that these companies make money from it. And I think, again, we're pointing the finger wrong of who's bearing these costs, because if you look at, and Todd Miller just did this analysis, he came to DU, I think it was a year and a half ago, that the 13 of the top border security firms donated more to the Biden campaign than they did to Trump. And I think that's really important. There's what they call a border industrial complex. There are companies and actors and politicians that benefit from there always being a perpetual crisis at the border because it is profitable. Grubhub, Raytheon, Geo, CCA, and then you look at obviously the cost to detain people and deport them, when there's many more economical ways, either that you could process people at the border, whether that's letting them in or denying them at that particular time. There's much more economical ways to do that. Or, wouldn't it be easier, and they've talked about this actually, just outfitting processing centers to why put children in these facilities for days on end and then in Health and Human Services when they have family sponsors right here in the United States that you could match them up with if we actually put the resources there, or if we put our resources into our understaffed immigration courts and asylum courts and asylum officers. I mean, those are significantly underfunded compared to what we are pouring the money in. And I think, you're alluding to some of the costs in this, but again, I think we also have to look at who's profiting from this and why, there's many argued, and this Tanya Golish-Bosa, she's a sociologist, is why do we pass immigration policies that are deemed to fail? They don't stem migration. They, at worst, harm people's human rights, but they're profitable. And I think they're profitable on both sides of the aisle. And that's why we've seen this kind of the border being kicked around like a political football, that when we had debates on immigration reform that failed in the previous 2 decades, the whole impetus was, well, we need to secure the border first, right? Legalization after, maybe a pathway to citizenship, but first the border needs to be secured. And this is exactly what Biden is heading off right now. It's exactly what he's dealing with. The problem is we have no way to actually measure what that means, right? We have no idea what a secure border, what out of control looks like. As people like Peter Andreas, like the border has never been this perfectly hermetically sealed place, and it never really caused that much of a problem. We've had almost no association with things like terrorism coming across the US-Mexico border, but it's a very convenient kind of political ploy. It's politically popular, it's politically profitable, and it stalls these debates because there's almost no way to show that it's possible. For example, does more apprehensions, does that mean there's more border security? Or does that mean that there's more people just trying to get through, so we've caught more of them, right? It's almost impossible to measure. And by that means, we keep ourselves in this perpetual crisis mode.
Let me ask, I'm tempted to follow up on that one. If we have time, maybe we will. But Bear McConnell asks, we talk a lot about the difficulties of controlling the 2,000 mile plus US-Mexico border. I've wondered why there's not enthusiasm about bilateral efforts to, quote, control the much shorter Mexico-Guatemala border. And you've done work on the border.
Well, that's actually what my first book is about. So this is actually a great question. And we absolutely do. And, this is something we've seen kind of ramp up in the past, I guess, half decade, but it's been something that has waxed and waned in US interest since at least the 1980s, when Central Americans were coming through Mexico and fleeing instability then, when we also didn't grant them asylum and refugee protections. And, these are the kind of cyclical issues that are still impacting why, people, why this instability is still happening. And in fact, we've had multiple times where we've tried to what many call externalize the border, which is, cultivate Mexico's migration management to deter our own flows. And in fact, it's sometimes like playing whack-a-mole. So when we had the kind of increase in unaccompanied minors and migrants in 2014, what did we do? We negotiated Programa Frontera Sur with Mexico, which led them to not necessarily control their border. They don't necessarily have the resources to do that. It may be shorter, but the terrain is incredibly difficult. I mean, it ranges from mountains to volcanoes to jungles to rivers. But what Mexico does instead is have more of what some people, Wendy Vogt has called an arterial border. It kind of waxes and wanes, right? You have these highway checkpoints. There are mobile checkpoints. There's now increasingly integrated checkpoints that block off entire highways in southern border states. And what happened is that Mexico's detentions and deportations increased, and so ours decreased, right? And then all of a sudden, you kind of had those flip-flop back and forth. And I think it's incredibly problematic because, a lot of Mexico doesn't really have the infrastructure to support this. And in fact, you're seeing actually Biden let in some more families now too to pursue their claims, because Mexico passed laws saying that they can't hold children, including children who are with their families, in their detention facilities. Their access to protection there is also not very good. And in fact, you've seen increasing migration from Mexico starting to tick back up again, because in the last couple of years have been some of the most violent in Mexico's history. We've seen those, rates of homicide and violence and insecurity go up in Mexico as well. But and then you had Trump obviously threaten the trade tariffs, right, which led Mexico to put the National Guard at their border. Now you have Biden kind of doing the same thing, right? He's not negotiating safe third country agreements anymore, but we've, funded border forces in El Salvador. We've trained people in Guatemala, and now Biden is using COVID diplomacy, right? So he's saying, cultivating Mexico to assist with deterring people by offering COVID vaccines, which is, I think we're going to see increasingly this kind of COVID diplomacy, seeing the inequity of vaccine distribution that we've had around the world. So I would say that this is something that we have tried to do, but in fact, it's, you can't necessarily turn off migration, or just solve this issue with more force, right? The human rights implications aside, because it doesn't really tackle the reasons why people are moving, or why they're also drawn to come here, and also why Mexico for people isn't necessarily a livable possibility either, especially from people from Central America.
So we have time maybe for one last question, I think, and Sarah Wakala. Apologies if I mispronounced your name. Would you address the specifics of what unaccompanied minors actually means? There's harmful narratives out there, there may be misassumptions about them. How many children are actually showing up totally alone versus how many are coming with an aunt, uncle, grandparent, etc. Or as you say, how many presumably have relatives, close relatives already in the U.S.?
I think that's such an important question, and I think one that we've seen now elaborated, because many of them are kind of like the 14 to 16-year-old range, where you don't see many like very young children who are truly not accompanied by an adult. And in fact, exactly what you mentioned is what's happening. People don't often come completely alone, but have come with another family member, or maybe a human smuggler. And we have these kind of nefarious images of smugglers. But why do we need smugglers? Because we make it so hard for people to migrate and even to reach safety. I mean, so if you think about these kind of policies, especially in Europe and Australia, that preclude people from getting to their territories, right? Or we externalize the border to Mexico, they need a smuggler to even ask for asylum, because you can't even get to that country's territory. We have the legal right to claim asylum. And so I think that there's some problematic discourse with that as well. But yeah, many of these children aren't actually unaccompanied, but we've made them unaccompanied. And I think this is exactly what we saw. It's not as obviously as drastic or as cruel, as what happened in the family separation policy, but that also created unaccompanied children by separating children from their parents. And previously, before that, there were very few instances of which children wanted to be separated. There's a very high bar, if they were being mistreated or clearly not being cared for. But the Trump administration also, even when court orders tried to limit that, interpreted that incredibly broadly. And so they were actually still separating people even after they weren't even supposed to anymore. And we still know that we're still looking, right, to reunite some of those families. And so I think the unaccompanied rhetoric, well, yes, some, are coming by themselves. Many have been made unaccompanied by our immigration policies, and the fact, under Trump, that he started prosecuting all of these parents unilaterally. And since legally you couldn't hold children in those facilities, that's what they were using to separate them.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. So let me just thank Professor Rebecca Galemba for such a nuanced and informative discussion of these issues. And that really, I think, helps all of us understand better than we do if all we do is read the mass media on these issues.
There's some really good pieces out there, though, so I'm happy to send them.
You referenced quite a number, and really, really helpful. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Wonderful to have a chance to talk with you about these issues. And let me thank all of you in the audience for being with us today. I wish you a happy Friday and a lovely weekend. And thank you again for being with us on Faculty Friday.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.